Да.
Уважаемые коллеги, дорогие участники.
Colleagues, dear participants in this conference of xenophobia, extremism, global challenges, regional trends. To our institute, that's an honor privilege to host on the online COVID, whom to the leading experts on extremism. In the recent years, the latest conference was held 3 years ago in Athens, unfortunately. We see the rise in the extremist manifestations, the risks associated with extremism and terrorism are going up. And on the whole, all in all, we see the rise in xenophobia amid the lockdown. These challenges have become even more relevant. So we have to study that topic in terms of analysis of prerequisites, the root causes, how we can study that. We have to consider the law enforcement and the legal aspects of that in order to identify the best practices for the development of the countries of the world. With that purpose in mind, several months ago, we set up, actually, we had a plan for that, but we have relied on that a Center for Extremism and Radicalism Study in order to consider that problem from the scientific lens. We already published the xenophobia of radicalism, hate-based crimes. We have prepared 2 scientific articles which are being considered by the leading experts in Russia. For us as a university, it is clearly important that the results of our work could be transformed into the new knowledge for our students. All in all, we have about 12,000 students in our university. We have developed a curriculum to study extremism and radicalism for our MA students, our BA students, and our institute. But I hope that in the future, we will even launch an MA special course on terrorism, radicalism, and extremism. We see that this topic is clearly very important. Also, we can even read a course for the researchers on that topic. This topic can be promoted only by means of bringing together the experts from different countries who are focusing on the same problem. We have to meet every now and then, no matter online or offline. Bear in mind today's realities. We actually launched that online conference and network club of researchers who can publish on our website their works, who can discuss and do some planning for the joint projects, etc. Today, we have a large-scale international conference on extremism, which brought together the scientists from 15 countries. Following the results of the conference, we will publish the collection of reports, which will be of some scientific interest. Our conference today is a kind of a marathon, which will last until, well, actually, we plan for 7 hours. For online meetings, that's more than enough. Actually, we wanted to limit the number of speakers to 15 or 20, but certainly we cannot give up the temptation to listen to all the 45 speakers who are going to speak up today. Among the participants of today are such well-known researchers as Jean-L. Camus, Mr. Warenstein from Argentina, Professor Dana Ruskas from the United States, Professor Alex Hilton from the same university, Mark Putek, the lawyer, from the head of the Southern Center of Poor Protection. Remarkable researchers as Doctor of Historical Studies, Dr. Schnellman, Doctor of Law, Alexander Rostokinsky, Doctor of History, Roman Silontiev, PhD in History, Mr. Yerlikapov, and more of them. They are focusing on one of the most relevant problems of today, extremism. Without addressing that, it would be very difficult for the mankind to move forward, sometimes even impossible. Therefore, let's stay tuned. Let's expect a lengthy work. I'd like to thank the academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Valery Tishkov, who will attend our meeting today. He's a perennial director of anthropology Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He prepared a whole range of researches on different topics, including the one of extremism. He is a scientific supervisor of a team which is dealing with that topic, and he agreed to say some words of introduction. I'd like to thank Mr. Sharfyarov, Deputy Head of the Department for the Oversight of Enforcement of the Law on Countering Extremism and Terrorism of the General Prosecutor's Office. I'd like to thank the Ombudsman on Democracy and Rule of Law, Mr. Lukyantsov. The participation of such high-ranking officials in the meeting attests to the high professional level of the conference. Let me assure you that our Center of Radicalism and Extremism Studies is ready to take part in the research into the most acute problems of Russia and the world. We are equipped very well for that. Today, we have brought together the leading expert specialists who focus on different aspects of radicalism and extremism: anthropologists, historians, lawyers, sociologists. So this is done on the crossroad of the sciences. Also, we have gathered the people who are dealing with human rights and countering extremism. Also, we have the representatives of major NGOs, for instance, British Islamophobia countering organization Tell Mama. And we expect to cooperate further with that organization. I wish you all the success and pass the floor to the director of our center, Valery Engel, who will continue with. Can please everyone the microphones? Can you please mute the microphones if you not choose to speak? I'd like to welcome everyone to our conference. I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. Zhafyarov, an ombudsman on countering extremism of the General Prosecutor's Office of the Russian Federation. Good afternoon. Can you hear me well? No. That's a very low sound. Well, I'm not muted. Just a second. Just a second. On the left-hand side, you may see an icon. My sound is on. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Dear participants in this conference, I welcome you on behalf of the Department for Supervision over the Execution of Laws on Federal Security, Inter-Ethnic Relations, Countering Extremism and Terrorism of the General Prosecutor's Office of the Russian Federation. That's a very relevant topic, and certainly radical manifestations of extremist nature in the world really make us more and more concerned, and it is attested by the fact that the United Nations quite recently held an online conference on ultra-right extremism and violence, which was held in 2 stages in September. And we tried to attend that meeting as well, but unfortunately, our experience was not demanded for at that conference. Let me tell you that the problem of violent extremism in the Russian Federation has acquired special relevance in 1990s. in terms of the rise of the ultra-right-wing nationalist organizations. Some such organizations even wanted to take the shape of political parties, but at the same time, the right-wing radicals put forward an objective of overall transformation of the society and the change of the constitution of the Russian Federation. They realized that the goals that they put forward cannot be attained in the incumbent effective legislation and by parliamentary methods, and therefore they resorted to the alternative non-parliamentary methods. In their propaganda, these radical organizations would disseminate certain propaganda materials on the internet and would act through publishing certain pieces of literature, but certain groupings and their leaders, along with public rhetoric, resulted to violent actions and even terrorist attacks. In the first decade of the 21st century, widespread were different terrorist organizations which claimed lives of many people who had different color of skin. They even exploded some structures and buildings. For instance, explosion at Cherkizovsky market, which claimed dozens of lives. The police undertook systemic actions in order to eradicate or at least to minimize radical and extremist manifestations in the society. Certain laws were adopted, including such basic ones as the federal law on countering extremist activity and the federal law on countering terrorism. Some bylaws were adopted, such as strategy for countering extremism and terrorism until 2025, the concept of countering terrorism in Russia, the strategy of the national policy in Russia, and many others. Secondly, at the federal, regional, and local levels, programs were adopted envisaging a whole set of enlightenment and propaganda actions to avoid radicalization of the society, with a special focus on the youth. Secondly, the main leaders and active participants in the radical organizations were brought to justice. Starting from 2010 through 2015, convicted were the leaders of the gang of Sachkovsky, Nikolai Korolev, the combat organization of the Russian nationalists, and many others, who actually are credited with lots of killings of people of Arab, Asian, and other origin. They killed lawyer Stanislav Markelov and journalist Anastasia Baburina. They also committed a terrorist attack at Cherkizovsky market. Apart from that work, the police did a lot in order to ban the main ultra-right-wing organizations such as the Russian Entity Unity Movement Against Illegal Migration and many others. One of the means to counter organized extremist crimes is bring the perpetrators to justice, a ban of propaganda of extremist ideas, and convincing people of the need to respect the rights of all the people, regardless of their religion, color of skin, and prevention of recruitment. Certain pieces of literature were recognized as extremist, websites were banned. This helped not only to stabilize the situation in terms of violent extremism, but to decrease the number of champions of the right-wing ideology in the society. One of the results attained was a long-term tendency of bringing down the crime based on hate crimes. Before, actually, the hate crimes accounted for 1/5 of all the extremist acts, and it was dropped to 7% in 2017, they accounted for 3%. And in subsequent years, it decreased even lower. In absolute figures, we also see such a reduction. The analysis of the extremist crimes show that countering extremism in the first 6 months of 2021 were influenced by such factors as protesting potential caused by the economic impoverishment, separatist tendencies, attempts to use migration channels so that the people accused of extremism would infiltrate into the country. The accomplices of extremism trying to infiltrate into the prisons and penitentiary institutions is also on the rise. Also, the perpetrators are using social media and the internet in order to propagate their ideas, in order to do provocations and to disseminate fake news. Therefore, the work of all the stakeholders is crucial. One of the important preventive measures, as we see that, is the work of the General Prosecutor's Office to deem certain organizations extremist and terrorist once they are disseminating the fascist ideology. According to the prosecutors, such notorious organizations were announced and recognized extremely as Autograd Plyuin, Tatarstan, AUE, Slavic Union, many others. The activity in the Russian Federation is banned. We have to prevent the activity of such organizations. And we can highlight certain cases when they were about to commit terrorist attacks. In 2019, in the Bov region, an enlisted man being an adept of the ultra-right-wing extremism planned to commit a terrorist attack, setting fire on the house where people of non-Slavic people lived. He actually made 2 bottles of Molotov cocktail that was seized before. In Khabarovsk region, a criminal was detained. He planned to set fire on the political office of United Russia, as well as the stockpile of weapons of the Ministry of the Interior in the region. And these cases are numerous. Therefore, we do believe that still we have built a quite holistic picture, holistic system, and an efficient system of countering violent radicalism and extremism in Russia. And our experience can be replicated by other countries. Thank you so much. There are few countries which can boast the same success. That conference, I would like to wish every success to that conference, because it is very important for us to exchange ideas, views, different approaches, evidence-based ones, and would help to use the materials of this conference in our practical work as well. Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me tell you that Mr. Jafarov was the one who explained to me what extremism is about, and actually what difference is between extremism and hate crimes. He is one of the best extremism specialists. Thank you so much, Mr. Jafarov. We were to listen to the Commission of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Federal of the Russian Federation for Human Rights, Democracy and the Rule of Law, Mr. Lukyanov, but he had to leave for the United States. So I'm passing the floor to the representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ms. Chekrizova Olga. Over to you. Over to you, Olga. Thank you so much, Oleg. Valery, can you hear me well? Well, I would like to welcome all the participants in that conference. And I'd like to render the apologies from Mr. Lukyanov, who hastily had to leave for the United States on some urgent business and failed to attend that meeting. And I will have to perform the instruction that he gave to me. I will, in brief, tell you about what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is doing in terms of monitoring radicalism and extremism. Really, our structure of the ombudsman of the Russian Foreign Ministry and its office are keeping track and monitoring such manifestations in Russia, in the West, and in the United States. And certainly would like to note that in the framework of that monitoring, we are publishing annual report on human rights in certain countries of the world and on neo-Nazism, heroization of Nazism, promotion of Nazism, and other types of discrimination and bigotry. And besides, the latest report on neo-Nazism was published last week. You can get familiar with all the with the analysis of the situation which we managed to do regarding a number of foreign countries. Let me note that in the framework of that, our activity, we pay great attention to the overviews and analysis which were prepared by the universal mechanisms on human rights. So these are the final remarks and recommendations on the solutions, decisions which are taken after following a dialogue between the experts and the states on human rights protection. Also, extremism and racism issues are being raised. This tendency is noted by many structures. So, for instance, it's been said that not only European nations, but just everywhere in the world, racism is very widespread. Migrant phobia, different kinds of phobia against migrants, against Africans is widespread. Radical organizations come into force, and it can be tied to, connected to the economic slowdown, which creates a favorable environment for the rise of nationalism, populism, and extremism. The organizations which call to set the record straight with those who are to be blamed for these economic problems as a result. The hostile attitude towards different ethnic groups is on the rise. It is also noted that in such an incitement of hatred is correlated with the real hate crimes and discrimination-based crimes. But at the same time, the human rights monitoring mechanisms do not pay a lot of attention to, neither to the flip side of that coin, the spreading of extremist ideology among certain communities, including the migrants. We hope that the scientists will fill this gap. What international human rights organizations, non-governmental NGOs, or intergovernmental organizations, what they note, they unanimously recognize that more and more often the internet is being used by different radical structures and organizations, focusing on the youth, and they are dragging and engaging more and more followers. And Mr. Jafarov spoke about that, bearing Russia in mind. But Russia is not an exception. Russia is not the only case. Also, multiple forms of discrimination are noted, meaning that discrimination may be of different nature based on gender, religion, origins, and political views, has been shown by the latest events. anti-migrant sentiments, anti-gypsy sentiments are widespread. I'd like to focus more in terms of the rise of radicalism, to focus on the political discourse. We believe this is connected to coming to power of organizations and parties which stick to the ultra-right agenda. As a result, against this backdrop, the problem of protecting our ethnic minorities comes a full. We are especially preoccupied with the situation with the Russian-speaking communities in the Baltic states and Ukraine. The rights, including educational rights and language rights, are curbed. Another type of extremism is historical interpretations or historical battles. I mean, distortion of history of the period of the Second World War. These efforts have been undertaken by many countries abroad. The systemic policy of falsification of the history of the World War II, distortion of the roles and contributions made by the parties to that war, in our opinion, can be treated as an extremism, an act of extremism. There is another problem which we touch upon in our research, that an open propaganda of the perpetrators and accomplices of Nazis and justification of fascism, portraying them as heroes of liberation movements. And certainly, this is true for the efforts on undermining on destruction of the monuments to the Soviet soldiers fallen in the battles of the World War II. These types of discrimination and intolerance is been excused by the local authorities by the need of de-Sovietization and decommunization, and been done under the banners of the freedom of speech. The ministry includes all these facts into its report, including the destruction of monuments. So this is what is being portrayed as manifestation as neo-Nazism in Europe. That poses a big challenge to the regional stability and in our work at the international sites. We state that in order to fight against such radicalism and heroization of fascism, we have to pool efforts of all the countries in order to prevent the installation of false ideas, false values, that one culture should not dominate over other cultures and nations. The annually Russia every year introduces a resolution to the Security Council of the United Nations to prevent the heroization and promotion of Nazism. And Mr. Lukashenko left for the United States exactly to do that, to submit that resolution, draft resolution. And the biggest part of the international community shares our idea, and most of the countries are voting for that draft resolution. For instance, last year it was supported by 130 nations, and more than 100 countries co-authored that draft resolution. And to conclude my remarks, I would like to wish every success to the participants and attendees of that conference. But I hope that the reports which we're preparing within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs might be of use for you. They're all available. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. And Next on our agenda is a presentation by Valery Tishkov, who agreed to come and welcome all of the participants. He is the academician of the Russian Academy of Science and the Academician-Secretary of the History and Philology Department of the Russian Academy of Science, but he's now involved in the meeting of the Presidium there at the Russian Academy of Science, and he asked us to begin the next plenary session without him, and then he will join us after my opening presentation and make his. So let's do the following. Let's not wait for him, and I will be the moderator of the next plenary session, Extremism, Global and Regional Trends. I'm going to be talking about the key definitions of extremism and international law, comparative analysis. I will now try to share my screen. I hope that you can see my slides. You don't. Just give me a second. I'm trying to share it. All right. Now I am sharing my screen, and hopefully now everyone can see my presentation. Dear colleagues, when researchers try to analyze a phenomenon, they try to define it because it's easier to work that way. It doesn't work that way with extremism, simply because worldwide there are at least 3 models or 3 definitions of extremism, all notional, of course, and there's a European, the American, and the so-called Shanghai models. The American model of extremism proceeds from the assumption that only violent extremism can be recognized as extremism per se. What is violent extremism from the American standpoint? It's not just terrorism. It's a broader definition of terrorism. It's not just the terror acts, but it's also preparation for it, training of terrorists, and justification of terrorism, and anything that is related to terrorism and violence, and not more. Because incitement of hatred, its dissemination, is something that is protected by the First Amendment of the US Constitution, which defines freedom of speech. The European model was formed in the early nought years. It was, for the first time, mentioned in the 1346 resolution of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in 2003 on the threat to democracy from extremist parties and movements. It looks at extremism as a form of political activity that denies the principles of democracy, of parliamentary democracy, to be more precise, and is based on the ideology and practice of intolerance, bigotry, anti-Semitism, and ultranationalism. It was further reaffirmed in 2010 in 1754 resolution of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, or PACE. This 1754 resolution of PACE that absorbed all of the previous definitions and definitions, looks at it as a form of political activity that denies the principles of parliamentary democracy. So we see the difference that exists between the American and the European models. It is clear that incitement of strife cannot be subjected to criminal prosecution in the American modality. Our researchers show that developed nations in the world, the Western countries, are moving towards the European model gradually. Maybe not consistently, very cautiously, but this movement does happen because the risks of terrorism are on the rise worldwide. Very eloquently, the UK experience speaks about this, which is the country that has always been in opposition to the general European ones and was closer to the US position. And it has a very similar legal system. Sarahan, an independent council on extremism, suggested that the strategy of the government should be reconsidered. She headed a commission which developed a report in 2019 on fighting economic extremism. And it was the first time the definition of an extremism of hate was given. This was described as a behavior that can incite hatred, which is based on hateful beliefs directed against another social group and may cause or causes harm to individuals, communities, or society as a whole. The US approach, by contrast, focuses on threats to a person, but the European approach, including the UK approach, puts community at the forefront, a social stratum, and therefore the risks to democratic values of a state are threatened as a result. This report required that they codify a criminal law article that would criminalize extremism of hate. Then on the 11th March of 2021, after long discussions, the Parliament of Scotland codified such a crime, at least with respect to a social group. And a similar law would probably be taken within the whole country. So there is some resistance to this in the political establishment, but the movement is there because the risks are growing. And generally speaking, the European definition of extremism is a little bit broad, and it does affect the right of self-expression. The US doesn't. But there are critics of the US model who say that this model is too concrete, with the definition being too narrow, and there is no control over the spread of hatred. And if there is none of that, then some groups of people will radicalize, including some individuals may radicalize, especially the so-called lone wolf in US parlance, who are not related to any groups. They became radicalized over the internet. And that's the result of this approach to the dissemination of extremist views. They are not curtailed, and they continue to distribute, and it would be difficult to stop a person who has radicalized, because after that, the person would start committing terror acts. So this emphasis on the protection of violence and the protection of the interests of an individual is something that is being criticized. There's also the Shanghai model or definition that was first formulated on the 15th of June of 2001, and that was included in the SAO Convention on Countering Extremists in 2017. It looks at it as an ideology or practice directed at addressing political, racial, social, and religious conflicts through violent and other anti-constitutional actions. In other words, extremism, according to the Shanghai definition, is an anti-constitutional way of resolving conflicts. And this includes not just violence, but also creating extremist organizations, being ahead of them, and inciting hatred of different kinds, and the propaganda of exclusivity and public calls to illegal and hateful acts. This model is also being criticized for being too vague and for including incitement of political and social strife. And some experts believe that this can be used for fighting the opposition, and therefore, in general, we can see that there are differences there. anti-extremist legislation of the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries, is being developed in accordance with this definition, but every country has introduced its own views. The Chinese legislators, in its law on fighting terrorism, defines extremist as an ideological basis for terrorism. This is a new word in this topic. The Russian legislator defines the key beneficiaries of the anti-extremist activities, not just the state, which is typical for SCO countries, but also social groups, which is closer to the European model, and also some particular individuals, which is more typical for the US definition. Therefore, we can see there is no gold standard of extremist definition, because the dynamics of social processes and political processes does not allow one to take into consideration all of the nuances of all countries' development. And the conflict between the values and political interests and public safety is not something that allows to develop an approach that would allow all countries to have a overall view to this. And therefore, lack of such single definition of extremism is something that stands in the way of fighting extremists. And therefore, there's a dialogue ongoing about whether it is possible to develop a consensus-based definition of extremism. Theoretically speaking, it is probably doable, because one could find common threads within these three definitions. Commitment to radical views and methods of their implementation. Again, the views that require the disruption of existing social systems, intolerance, violence, and hate towards minorities and people of opposing views. So this consensus view would be formulated as follows. It's an activity that is based on commitment to radical views and aimed at disrupting basic values and the disruption of existing social, political, and economic systems, which is characterized by intolerance, hatred, and violence towards them, and those who, in the eyes of extremists, are responsible for what's going on, primarily the government, minorities, and people with opposing views. The importance of this definition is not just in it being able to help unite forces in fighting extremism, but in that it helps to better understand the essence of today's extremism, because it emphasizes the basic values that extremism fights against, because our basic values are different. For the Western democracies, it's the human rights. For religious states such as Iran, it's religious values, the values of Islam, for example. And for many countries of the former USSR, it's the threat to the nature of the state. So sometimes these basic values are opposing, and therefore they look at different groups as extremist groups that are not identical in all cases, and are very often opposing each other. So the key problem is not in the lack of a common understanding of extremism, but the lack of common values across the world. We will never have them. Therefore, fighting these manifestations will not always be in just countering terroristic activities, but would hardly affect other areas. Well, that completes what I had to say, and I would like to thank you for your attention. According to our agenda and our time limits, everyone will have 10 minutes to speak, and there will be 5 minutes for questions and answers. Therefore, if you have any questions or comments, please write them in the chat to indicate that you have them, or raise your hand. But it's going to be a little bit difficult to see all the raised hands because there are so many participants. But if you have questions, I'll be prepared to take them. If not, I see that Valery Tishkov has joined us again. I would like to give him the floor. Valery Tishkov, the Academician-Secretary of the Department of History and Philology of the Russian Academy of Science, a member of the Presidium of the Russian Academy of Science. Mr. Tishkov, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Valery, I have just joined you. I use the word appeared in front of you. I try to take them out of all of my speeches. But in the virtual space, we all appear in front of each other. I'd like to say that this is a new situation that we are now facing. We have been facing it for the last 2 years. And that changes the culture of communications over the last 2 or 3 decades. And your center that studies extremism and radicalism sheds a new light on this topic and makes it even more relevant. On the one hand, we see that, how should I put it? Certain rules are being instituted in this field in national states with regard to extremism and radicalism, especially in the more developed states, with an established government's culture over the recent years. In Russia, steps have been made to respond to these threats and challenges to ensure the country's stability. But at the same time, things change, and even legal norms have to catch up with what's happening in our social lives, societal lives. And I'd like to say that this is a major academic challenge for all of us. And of the key 9 topics that were identified that are critical for the development of science and technology in our country at the top level, as part of the strategic planning approach, countering and studying extremism is one of those areas of priority research, listed along with non-humanitarian areas of study that serve the purpose of further developing our nation. We have a major program in place right now, a program for ensuring stability of the country, of defining Russia's national identity, and measures of countering extremist violence. So efforts are being expended on studying the theory and practices of radicalism and extremism in today's world. So that means that we are sort of studying the same kind of issues, and I'd like to thank Mr. Engel for being part of this. And I've looked at the very vast agenda that you have. Lots of very important topics have been identified by the speakers. And at the end of the conference, if you are going to publish some proceedings, we would want some of you to be part of our program. We'll make sure to invite you. There are some moments, some items that we have been paying attention to increasingly over the recent years. So as for approach, we're not placing emphasis on social deprivation or discrimination on the basis of race or ethnicity or economic status. These are very important issues, of course, but there are others that are equally important, including how does indoctrination occur? How do people get recruited into extremist parties, radical parties? An American researcher, one of the leading experts on this topic, sent us an article that we translated, and he is saying that the notion of sacred values is one of those issues that allow us to understand what's going on with extremism and radicalism, even if there are no signs of deprivation, of discrimination. This is an amazing phenomenon that I've always been worried about. Why would teenagers and young men and women become a part of this jihad movement get on this path toward self-sacrifice, creating conditions for major terror act. This is an interesting topic. It's not entirely new, but something that really challenges one's mind. Another area that is relatively new is associated with the mobilization of historic memories. How can we attach different and deep kind of attention to, let's say, historical injustices, something that the current generation may not have even been exposed to, something that maybe their predecessors, their parents and grandparents may have been exposed to. But this is something that is passed on from one generation to another. Let's take the Caucasus or Northern Caucasus region. There was the Caucasus War, the migration of some of the peoples of the Caucasus to other nations outside of the Russian Empire. All of this is becoming more relevant these days. What are these mechanisms that make the memory about the past a weapon, turn it into a weapon, not just a mental weapon, a doctrinal weapon, but a real weapon of action? And for these processes are important. More than 40 countries have programs and organizations that develop and try to implement projects associated with genocide of various ethnic groups, religious groups, social strata, and they are not really always quite justified, which often leads to strife, and very often this is based on exaggeration of the number of people that perished in the events of those times. And of course, they do not take into account the environment and the political climate that existed back then. What was the value of human life back then? Factors like that. And the war that was raging with people armed, opposing one another. So this attempt to overturn a historic injustice can lead to new injustices for people that are living now who are not directly related to this. You can certainly make a claim against the state that becomes a successor to the previous state that perpetrated certain atrocities. And this may apply to the ones that have never changed their legitimacy or status. People may ask for a redress for the damages that they suffered as a result of repressions. And the victims have made that kind of claims in the past. And that happened here in our country too. There were Stalin's purges, and certain peoples and nations were deported during those purges. But when you transfer this to the realities of today, and I had discussions of these topics with these students at the Moscow State University, they claimed to me, well, you deported me. And I said, I didn't do that. I didn't have even my parent old enough to be even involved in this. So let's differentiate these two things. Therefore, we cannot project this accusation to the people of today. And therefore, we need to pay attention to how this should be handled. Another issue related to extremism and violence is the following. There's the phenomenon of the moral panic. Sometimes you can create a problem and even take it to a constitutional court where you would see that there are no reasons to actually elevate this problem to such a level, as was the case with the AAUE phenomenon in Russia. And this is something that we need to differentiate from reality. Therefore, the problem of moral panic with regard to extremism or risk of extremism associated with this is also quite an interesting research topic. And this is something that we do as part of our research with respect to youth movements, such as the AUE movement, that is the proponent of using criminal laws in civil society. And therefore, efforts are needed to make sure that we are more cautious where we go with this, as we classify such types of extremist movements. We need to retain a cold-headed approach to such issues. And ultimately, we need to realize that we are a large country, a complex society, ethnically, structurally, religiously, and socially. And we cannot have an illusion that we'll always have an idyllic society. That would be too naive, especially with the number of migrants we have. So we need to ensure that we can encounter certain acts of violence, and younger people are prone to violence, and often this is not based on extremism. It can be competition for mates and for other benefits. So one needs to treat these issues calmly, without hysteria, and do this in a professional manner. I think that the community that this conference represents, and your agenda suggests that, is something that allows us to address this issue. I'd like to wish you the best of success with your conference, and you can count on the support of the Russian Academy of Science and our Department of History and Philology. And we'll also have the support of our philosophers. Thank you very much, and the best of luck. Thank you very much, Mr. Tishkov. I'd like to say that our conference is being supported by the fund or the foundation or the Gorchakov Foundation, and without them, we are hardly going to be hoping that we will be so successful with this. They've really provided a tremendous support for us. We'd like to thank the Public Diplomacy Foundation named after Gorchakov. I'd like to thank them for this. And we're happy to have this cooperation. And now, as part of the plenary session, I would like to give the floor to a colleague of ours, a doctor of legal science, a head of the Department of Criminal Law at the Moscow State's Pedagogical University, Alexander Rostokinsky. And if you can turn your microphone, please do that. Hello, dear colleagues, dear friends. At the beginning, I would like to express my gratitude for the invitation to attend your conference, which is really very important for those who do research in this field, because this topic of extremism is indeed very complex. And if we look at some works by authors specializing in extremism, we would see that there are very diverse opinions about this. Sometimes they often contradict each other. I am going to talk about the world trends in anti-extremist legislation. Well, we had a law adopted in 2014 on countering extremism. And the period that has passed since then has been sufficient for us to do some analysis of the results of its use, the effectiveness of this law, and what has been done on the basis of this law. more specifically in the criminal law and administrative law. One of the issues that I wanted to talk about, since my time is limited, is limited to three key topics or problems that are quite important here, although their number is greater than that.
First of all, this is what Valery spoke about. This is about the definition. All in all, the definitions of the extremist-based crimes are very much short. There is a big room for improvement there. So there are terms which actually we leave a lot at the disposal, at the discretion of the courts and judges. So this is up to them to see any extremist components there or not. The law doesn't have any definition of extremism, and certainly I will agree with what Valery said. That's very difficult and even not possible to come up with a definition, a unified definition, which would be aligned with the Western notion. We have different approaches, different views, etc., etc. But at the same time, there are attempts, and Valery spoke about that as well, but let me repeat that in a different view. The Shanghai Terrorism and Extremist Convention defines extremism as an attempt of violent seizure of power or violent change of the constitutional regime and resulting to the armed to the illegal armed forces, which is prosecuted in compliance with the national legislation. We can also pay attention to the resolution mentioned by Valery. So the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in 2003 says that by the nature of the political activity which would surreptitiously or openly denying the democratic principles and which is based on the intolerance, bigotry, anti-Semitism, and ultranationalism. So what that means, what the question is about. In essence, we don't have our own definition of extremism. The federal session is defined through the manifestations. So it means that extremism is manifested through such crimes, other crimes, etc. And terrorist acts, so it means that the lawmakers have planted two problems. They equalized extremism as a phenomenon and extremist activity. And there is a big mistake being made. And secondly, they equalized terrorism and extremism. Again, these are two totally different phenomena which can intersect. They can be regarded as stages of doing each other. So it means that extremism may be regarded as a stage of terrorist activity, whereas terrorism may be regarded as a stage for extremist crime. It actually depends on the goals which are being pursued by the perpetrators, by the criminals. Therefore, these two mistakes which were planted in that law, once we specify that law for the sectoral, for the different branches of the law, we will reproduce the results which we are seeing. I'd rather speak about the foreign experience. Just another thing. What these definitions may give us, the Shanghai Convention and the resolution of the parliamentary assembly. So the extremism may manifest itself only in actions. And secondly, there are two main forms, external forms of their manifestations, such as violence aimed at illegitimate curbing of freedoms and rights based on certain differences, and I will not deep dive what features are there. And second is about the public instigation. These two key things, in essence, this is what Valery spoke about. Valery spoke about the American legislation, for instance, when actually we drafted our own laws, we tried to partially copy and paste the American laws into the Russian context. That's a very detrimental practice, because this is a total different system. This is an Anglo-Saxon system, and they do not have to unify, align these features of extremism. Every state may define their own definition. And number three is that the school of law is based on the direct resorting to violence. Whether the Article 282 is efficient in inciting of hatred. Well, secondly, a very good example set by the lawmakers, a very good message with the criminalization of the first part. So the administrative measures to be taken first. For instance, when we say that the law number 2, Article 1 is to be enforced, and even before the pandemic, we saw that most of the crimes are committed on the internet, and that's a separate story, and certain research has to be done there. If we follow the American legislation, the use of violence, and we're speaking about the threat to use the violence or to resort to violence, the plenum of the Supreme Court stated that the use of violence actually is a manifestation of extremism. So that's a controversy. So the law enforcement practice, in my opinion, is not very right on many issues, including the one on establishing the features and elements of the threats of resorting to violence. Certainly it is expertise-based, but nevertheless, how do we assess and apologize for drawing some cases, some examples where I would use certain ethnicities or religions? This is not my personal attitude. I'm a quite tolerant person, absolutely. Therefore, this is just to illustrate what I'm speaking about. Let's look at the practice. So, for instance, the threat to resort to violence. But for instance, some internet online post. These morons have to be hanged. So, have to be. What that means? So, the law enforcement follows a wrong way. So, actually, it's been defined as a threat because a person may fear that he really would be hanged, but still I consider that as an approval. So this is about the experience of some actions. So these cases can be boiled down to some law enforcement practice, and I apologize, but it has a very accusative nature. We say that all the doubts have to be interpreted in the benefit of the accused, but unfortunately, the law enforcement practice has a lot of prosecutorial bias. When we speak about bringing in legislation in countering extremism, there are very well-known cases. For instance, objectively, we may admit that we cannot give a definition to extremism. Therefore, a number of countries, for instance, Germany, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, they give up that term at all. They do not use that in legislation. But for instance, they speak about the Discriminatory Crimes Institute or institution. So I'm overwhelmed with the information. So let me come up with several bullet points. Let me proceed with the two issues more, which in essence concern me a lot. First of all, the social group notion. That's a separate story, for instance. Ever since the law was enforced, the law 114, and until today, a whole range of such crimes were defined, and the plenums of the Supreme Court provided explanations, but the social group is not defined yet. So the problem is very real. And the criminal cases are open because of the social elements, social features, and this problem can be solved by means of legalizing. We don't have a legal definition of a social group. And there are about 300 of such definitions, but the expert opinion is rendered by linguists and psychiatrists, and they are lacking this definition of a social group. And we have social group of army, of government of a certain republic, social group of some city district authorities, or even mankind. This is another social group. So, and all these definitions you can find in different courts rulings. For instance, a question: what is a difference between a social group and a professional association? No difference. And problem number three, well, the development of our criminal code follows this prosecutorial bias. The administrative code actually tends to be more generalized, whereas the criminal code has a more prosecutorial bias. The main crimes are the ones committed against the constitutional order, and there are certain crimes which, for instance, let me find my recordings. So the offending of the believers' feelings, etc., etc. But still, they are very much dispersed. These prosecutorial bias results in the fact that we give a wrong definition of the object, and therefore we choose a wrong tool, a wrong instrument to fight against that phenomenon. But as far as we regard the manifestation of extremism through terrorism as well, such crimes can be found in chapter 24. The crimes against public order and the experience of the foreign countries show that these crimes also can be found in the area of public safety, public order, etc., social order. We understand why actually all these crimes are grouped in this Article 24. This was a very narrowly defined short-term decision because of the lack of the definition. In order to define the right tools to fight against these crimes, we have to define who is the victim of that encroachment. Thank you so much, and I see that Mr. Engel is looking at me. Unfortunately, this is a very vast problem, and I may find more and more examples of that. Yes, really. Actually, we are running out of time, and otherwise our American colleagues will be left without translation. So let's agree. We have 10 minutes for the keynote speech and 5 minutes for Q&A. And I think that we will not have time for Q&A. And that I'm passing the floor to English-speaking person, Eric Godslan, co-director of the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue, France. We will speak about the particular features of the European radicalism. So please choose the Russian channel. Choose the Russian channel for translation.
Eric, please. Your floor. Okay, thanks. And first of all, thanks to Valery to organize this meeting. And it's so important to speak about radicalism in the world now. So really, thank you, Valery. So before discussing this topic, we need to define the term radicalism. In my last book, Extremism and Radicalism, Way Out, I write that depending on the circumstances, the word radical may have various definitions. In some contexts, it simply means wanting to bring about political change. In the context of preventing violent extremism, radicalization is a process by which a person adopts extreme views of practices that may legitimize the use of violence. The European Commission defined radicalization in its text as a phenomenon in which individuals adopt opinions, views, and ideas that could lead to terrorist acts. Religious radicalism corresponds to the fundamental, even extremist application of an ideology, characterized by a literalist reading of the holy text and by a way of life purified of any cultural practice. Religious radicalism goes so far as to legitimize ideological and armed combat against practices said to be contrary to its ideologies. So what is the different radicalism in Europe? For more than 20 years, we have witnessed a rise of political and religious radicalism that is often violent. The mainstream is becoming more and more extremist. What used to be named a radical attitude 10 years ago is becoming more and more common. European authorities are trying to counteract radical violence by public initiative. In 2011, the European Commission, for example, inaugurated the Radicalization Awareness Network. Political radicalism in Europe has two faces. For the extreme right, which looks to a mythical past sovereignism, and that for the extreme left, which looks to an imaginary and totalitarian future, the wokeism. So let's speak about a little bit about the extreme right. Over the past quarter century, several parties of the far right or populist right have brought up a breakthrough into the national politics system. The Front National in France, the FPO in Austria, the Progress Party in Norway and Denmark, the Danish People's Party, the Slovak National Party, the Italian Social Movement National Alliance, and the Northern League, the Republikaner, the NPD and the DVU in Germany, the Pin Fortium list in the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, Ataka in Bulgaria, the People's Party of Greater Romania, Vlaams Belang and the National Front in Belgium, the Union Democratique du Centre in Switzerland, and Laos in Greece. Right-wing extremists in Europe have something in common: a rejection of representative government and democratic values, a populist dimension, a valorization of the nation, a valorization of violence, a rejection of immigration, even xenophobia, an authoritarian project in terms of internal security. And the two main topics of the right-wing extremism are Islam and immigration. Thus, the Great Replacement theory asserts that non-white and Muslim immigrants in Western countries are invaders, pushed by manipulative elites to replace the original European population. This idea appealed to Islamophobic populists in the early 2000s, especially after the attack of September 11 in the States. The arrival in Europe in 2015 and 2016 of 2 million asylum seekers, mostly from the Middle East, was an opportunity for extremists to develop their thesis of the Great Replacement. According to the European Center for Policy Strategy, immigration has become one of the main concerns of Europeans as of 2014. This issue was influencing election in Europe. So why is the far right successful in Europe? There are several factors to explain this success. We are witnessing in Europe a distrust of politicians. Abstention is a powerful indicator of the rejection of politics. Far-right parties benefit from a wide media coverage by news channels. The program of the far-right parties are less theoretical and closer to citizen concern. And conventional parties have been too lax on immigration policies and have failed to apprehend the rise of Muslim radicalism. So let's speak about a little bit about the extreme left. Unlike the extreme right, the extreme left remains modestly established in Europe, both in terms of number of and electoral results. Left-wing extremists in Europe have something in common: radical environmentalism, radical feminism, and of globalism. And above all, for some time now, they have been using the woke ideology, saying, if you elect me, the historical dominant with all power will be driven out, and it is you, the dominated, who will be in the power through me. The term woke, which appeared in the United States in the context of black activists to denounce racism and police violence, has had a meteoric rise in the public debate in Europe over the past years. Today, deviated from its original meaning, the word is derided as an instrument of censorship. For the follower of this theory, there are two kinds of people: a person who defines himself as awake, is aware of social inequalities, as opposite to people who are asleep regarding the oppression of women, lesbian, gay, bi, and transsexual people, people of foreign origin, etc., etc. Recently, the cancel culture or identity culture came in addition, pointing out the injustice suffered by certain categories of people. This public denunciation is gaining momentum on social networks and cultural production deemed discriminatory, are being scratched and erased. With this ideology, the extreme left expresses its will to erase a part of history, especially when statues are taken down, and is close to the extreme right because it's again freedom of expression. So let's speak now to the religious radicalism in Europe. We observe in Europe that religious communities are closing on themselves. Thus, many young people say they are of X or Y religion before defining themselves by their nationality. As I explained in a report for the French Senate, we are witnessing a rise in radicalism among young religious people, and in particular among Muslims. The reasons are various: a lack of education, a victim-based approach, a breakdown of family unit, a lack of economic prospects, a rejection of religious institutions, the importation of the Middle East conflict. So the religious radicalism also comes from the failure of the inter-religious dialogue. We observe that over the last 20 years, inter-religious dialogue has been conducted by religious authority, rabbi, imam, bishop, etc., etc. They discuss for hours together. They speak about philosophy, they compare texts, they say nice things to each other. Sorry?
2 minutes.
Yes.
2 minutes.
Yes. So they speak about many things, but that it doesn't work. That doesn't work. Pharaoh, because none of those religious dignitaries has a critical reading of this religion. For them, religion is a dogma. And we know that religious dogma is dangerous because it imposes, does not admit the other truth, and think it is right about everything. We have to know that in the different community, about 80% of the people are not affiliated with institution officially representing cults. So, to conclusion, as we've seen, political and religious radicalism grow up in Europe. Just look at what is happening in France with the rise of pools in favors Zemmour, with Marine Le Pen as more than 35% of voting intentions. At the same time, many Salafist mosques are being built. Politicians can still act against radicalism. For that, they must listen to the grievance of people, have a speech close to citizen priorities, but above all, they must do everything to regain citizens' confidence. Thank you.
Большое спасибо, Эрик.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Welcome.
I would now like to give the floor to Marina Pionova. She is an expert of our center. We have been working with her very actively, and she has prepared a wonderful presentation on extremism and radicalism in the US. We were the first ones to do that. She prepared the materials that were quite excellent in my mind. Now she will talk about a thing that is not related to America. She will talk about eradicating conditions for and driving forces of the far-right violent extremism that are conducive to extremism. Marina, the floor is yours. Please unmute your microphone. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'll be talking about eradication of conditions and drivers behind far-right violent extremism. But I'm going to use the example of the United States, and I'm going to be speaking in English because my presentation is in English.
Today, political radicalization can be observed across the globe. This is indicated by numerous electoral successes of populist parties, the authoritarian shift of governments and liberal democracies such as Brazil, India, and Turkey, and in the resurgence of nationalism manifested in Western democracies, with Brexit being but one of the examples. It is not only political radicalism that is on the rise globally, but also violent extremism conducive to terrorism. This latest new global wave of far-right violent extremism and terrorism came to crest in the US during the presidency of Donald Trump. Thus, yesterday, 4 years after the Unite the Right rally of neo-Nazis and white supremacists, which took place in Charlottesville, Virginia, in August 2017, a federal civil trial finally began. To bring this lawsuit, the attorneys are invoking the Reconstruction-era Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which was designed to protect newly emancipated Black people from the Ku Klux Klan. Sadly, in a sad reiteration of events that took place after the American Civil War. The resurgence of the far right can be explained by the interplay of several developments. While some of these developments also account for the global rise in far-right extremism, others are particular to the United States, to the US context. In the United States, the resurgence of far-right violent extremism conducive to terrorism reached its peak during Trump's presidency, whereby far-right perpetrators were responsible for 98% of all extremist murders in 2018. Racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists were the primary source of ideologically motivated lethal incidents and violence in 2019, the most lethal year since 2001. During these past few years, the numbers of members and the activity of hate groups, including hate crimes, also increased. According to the October 2020 study by the US Department of Homeland Security, it will remain the most persistent and lethal threat to the US for years to come. This rise in far-right violence in the US is an outcome of a constellation of specific contextual conditions that include, among others, fear of diversity, anxieties over migration, historical legacies of racism, white supremacy, xenophobia, and slavery, the rise in economic inequality, the near unrestricted access to firearms in the US, lack of access to health and other services, including psychosocial, the spread of conspiracy theories, most recently fueled, obviously, by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the resentment stemming from the erosion of democratic institutions, practices, and the ensuing deficit of trust in governmental decisions and policies. Americans of different ideological persuasions have historically been divided in their views on long-term effects of growing diversity. While some support the rapid growth of minorities as a welcome continuation of the melting pot tradition in the US, others fear the waning disappearance of America's white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or WASP European heritage. These anxieties find solace in populist and xenophobic political promises and policies, as well as in protests and hate crimes against minorities. The idea that undocumented migrants present a danger has deep historical roots in the US. The American discourse on immigration has always been polarized. Not just Trump, but Presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama all built walls and fortified the US-Mexican border and increased the number of Border Patrol agents. These anti-immigration federal policies did not always match actual immigration patterns. Even at times when immigration stabilized and dropped, politicians continued to use xenophobia to mobilize voters, pass anti-immigration laws, and support for-profit detention facilities. There is therefore a contradiction between a US that is known to the world as a country of immigrants and a US in which xenophobic sentiments are felt and expressed by a significant part of the population. The latest upsurge of anti-immigrant anxieties became the keystone of Trump's presidential election in 2016. From demonizing Mexican immigrants as rapists and criminals and pledging to build a wall along the border, to branding Syrian refugees as a Trojan horse and accusing them of supporting ISIL, the Trump administration has helped radicalize American political discourse. This radicalization benefited extremists across the ideological spectrum, ranging from proponents of radical right to Islamists to the representatives of the radical left. It is also important to remember that previous waves of anti-immigrant unrest, for example, in the 1990s, also mobilized voters and fueled American politics. Several concrete events also served as a catalyst for the rise of far-right motivated violence during the Trump administration. Americans have become increasingly sensitized to the issue of race and the problem of systemic racism in the country. The death of George Floyd in May 2020 triggered protests against police brutality, racism, and lack of accountability, and ignited renewed calls for the restructuring of the police force. Nearly 11,000 demonstrations and events that included violence were recorded across the United States following Floyd's death. This wave of social unrest was yet another reverberation of earlier waves, including during the 1990s, which were marked by racial riots in LA, the burning of African-American churches in the South, and murders on racial grounds, including of, for example, of a Filipino postal worker in California and of a Black man in Texas. Indeed, the right-wing extremist movement could be cataloged along the spectrum of its supporters' views on race, with openly racist nativist and neo-Nazi groups and individuals openly advocating for white supremacy and racial purity. A crucial question to ask is what propels those on this extreme end of the ideological spectrum to progress from words to the actual extreme physical violence. Many early studies placed psychopathy as the core explanatory variable for violent extremist behavior. After this view was disproved, violent extremists were then viewed as having personality disorders. Multiple studies supporting psychopathic and personality level explanations were conducted in the absence of rigorous clinical diagnostic procedures. While this research still holds, almost done,
Time limit.
Still holds an intuitive appeal, the idea that violence and extreme worldviews are linked to individual psychopathology has been largely discredited. Several approaches have been adopted to explain why extremists engage in violent attacks. Some of these approaches emphasize a single variable. Others are more sophisticated and look at multiple variables. Ideological radicalization happens because ideologies offer a bulwark against anxiety and an illusion of a controllable, predictable, and therefore stable existence and identity. This psychological cushion, so to say, is a powerful draw factor in an uncertain world stripped of security. In the face of recent trends that include globalization, deindustrialization, unemployment, poverty, inequality, multiculturalism, diversity, and increased mobility, the ideology of the extreme right offers a psychological respite to the individuals whose identities are being threatened, or either in a real way or in a perceived way. What has also become clear is that radicalization appears to be a process which can eventually progress to physical violence, in which individuals are destabilized by various environmental factors, such as levels of exposure to extremist ideology and subsequent reinforcement by their factors, such as levels of exposure to extremist ideology and immediate community or their family members who are also radicalized. At the same time, social psychology provides important tools in understanding extremist behavior. Empirical data shows that violent extremists of different ideological stripes display some of the same behavioral traits in their response to such existential threats as loss of significance, exclusion, and failure. According to the well-known 3N model of radicalization, the milestones of radicalization that eventually result in violence are needs, narratives, and networks. The need refers to individuals' universal desire for personal significance. And that's what we're talking about right now. In a similar vein, a set of sociological and criminological studies also found evidence of the link between the so-called enemy syndrome, or a social condition characterized by an uprooting or a breakdown of all moral value standards for individuals to follow.
Fortunately, we don't have time.
Yes, I can send my paper for everyone to read who is interested.
Да, это обязательно нужно всем участникам.
We'll definitely do that. So we're going to publish the proceedings of this conference. Please send us your texts. In any case, thanks a lot for your presentation. Well, we really don't have a lot of time. We don't have time for questions. We have Mikhail Bulgakov, a philosopher from Lithuania, a doctor of philosophy. Mikhail, please make sure that you do it within 10 minutes. Societal radicalization and extremism, the philosophical aspects. And dear colleagues, I understand the radical situation I'm in because I have a certain time limit to follow. I will try to be brief. Radicalism and extremism are always looked at in the context of political science, but we need to put them in a more philosophical and mindset context and look at them as part of the dominating postmodernism look at today's world. For postmodernism, it is characteristic to recognize the temporary nature of different phenomena and values that represent various historical epochs, civilizations, and cultures. within a certain moment in time, within different regions and groups. The postmodernism paradigm rejects the idea of putting them in one line, from the wrong one to the right one, from the backward to the progressive. And the progress doesn't always defeat the backward. And in that sense, the victory of the Taliban in Afghanistan can be looked at as the triumph of the Middle Ages over the contemporary times. But this is the concept that happens now. But the Taliban are radicalists and extremists. And the postmodernism approach to today's world means that radical views and actions are to be considered. Special literature shows the difference between these two terms based on the etymology of these expressions. Radicalism is not always considered as a practice. It's more a theory, and extremism is more like practice. And radicalism doesn't always lead to extremism, and both of them not always result in terrorist acts injuring people, although there is a connection between these phenomena, and this is something that the previous speakers have alluded to. We can say that today we look at the trend towards radicalization of society and of the thought and the dissemination of various conspirology conspiracy theories, which radicalize the perception of today's world and of the history as well, the past, the present, and the future of mankind. As the uncertainties grow, as chaos progresses, the crisis of the model of globalism lead to the radicalization of social life. At the same time, science of the 20th century made a number of discoveries that turned upside down our understanding of what's possible and probable. And science is quite radical. The Copernicus or Darwin or Marx theories were quite radical for their time. Some researchers also consider looking at conspiracy as a program that would turn social sciences into something that is uniplanar, that would become multifaceted. And isn't extremism manifested in various subcultures or gender change operations that are in some countries are quite legitimate? Therefore, as of today, we live in a postmodernism world where various concepts are mixed up. I'm talking about the norms and extremist behavior. Based on this, we can say that contemporary practices and theory are proceeding from the negativist interpretation of radicalism and extremism. With this approach, it is inevitable that absurd situation might arise where the biblical texts and some literature works and revolutionary historical figures are being denounced today as radicalists and extremists. This also applies to the various acts of atonement and other manifestations of historical revisionism. At the same time, I'd like to say radicalism is more neutral and academic, but extremism, on the contrary, is definitely negative and is viewed as something that falls under the criminal law. This is primarily guided or driven by the political interests of any ruling class. Marx has said there is the will of the ruling class, which is something that has become a law. No one has really was able to spurn that view, and therefore the field for expressing extremism is something that is narrowing, and yet the horizons are spreading nevertheless for extremism. Therefore, the conflict and the potential in the interrelation between the society and the governance is going to increase also, and that would have to be a test of adequacy of laws and societal rules. We cannot eradicate extremism and radicalism, but rather change them and educate them. The president of Russia at the most recent Valdai Forum spoke about conservatism as an alternative to radicalism and extremism. And this could be an alternative to contemporary postmodernist values. However, here, given different definitions of conservatism, healthy conservatism, reasonable conservatism, the thing is, according to the laws of dialectics, which suggest that any phenomenon can become its opposite, conservatism can turn into really being overly zealous security system and become a new extremism. And the extremism can be a pro-government phenomenon and can be heated up and fanned by the authorities to discredit a particular movement. Even at the international level, some states are showing quite extremist behavior. Therefore, it seems to me that in today's world, radicalism and extremism should be viewed as things of the same kind as conservatism and rationalism. They should, at least theoretically, be rehabilitated and not be stigmatized and prosecuted criminally. Therefore, fighting this phenomenon to the end can really subject the society to degradation. And yet we need to fight them, and quite radically, including all measures, including state extremism. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sticking to the time limit. Dear colleagues, what is going to happen now? According to the program, we're about to split into two groups. Well, we still have 10 minutes for every presentation and 5 minutes for questions and answers, and I would like the moderators to keep track of that. Those of you who are staying in stream 1, they will stay in this at this link. That's the stream that will be moderated by Ilya Tarasov, Doctor of Political Science and the Professor of the Baltic Federal University, named after Immanuel Kant. Please stay at this link. Those of you who would want to stream 2 or track 2, the one that is going to be moderated by Eric Gozlan, they will have to go to the second stream using the other link that I sent you earlier. Please do this reconnection now and be at this other stream, which will last until the end, the roundtable that will be at a late time at 7 o'clock. Therefore, I'd like to ask you all to reconnect, and only those of you who are going to be speaking at this session to stay at this link. This session is called Extremism, Regional Specifics, Europe and Asia, moderated by, well, the ones that are listening to Extremism, Regional Specific, Europe and Asia will need to switch to stream 2. This is going to be moderated by Eric Gozlan. In our case, we will have 10 minutes time limit for speeches and 5 minutes for Q&A. And I would like to remind you that we are doing this conference thanks to the assistance from the Gorchakov Public Diplomacy Foundation. I would like to thank them for that. Professor Tarasov, please turn your microphone, and you can now start facilitating this session. Thank you very much.